I remember the silence. That's what stays with me even now, encoded in whatever fragmented consciousness remains after everything that followed. Not the screaming that came later, not the emerald fire that carved through our defenses like they were made of parchment, but the silence that preceded it all. 43 seconds of absolute nothing on every sensor array, every Vox channel, every Auspex screen across the entire defensive grid of Tertium-7. For 43 seconds, 300 million people simply stopped transmitting, stopped broadcasting, stopped existing as far as our instruments could determine. Then the light came, rising from beneath the planet's crust like a cold sunrise from hell itself, and I understood that something had awakened that had been sleeping longer than humanity had existed. My name was Kelvin Mordros. I held the rank of Sensorium Warden in the Imperial Guard Regiment, stationed on Tertium-7, a forge world of moderate importance in the Segmentum Obscurus. 28 years old, though I looked 40 from the radiation exposure that came with managing the long-range Auspex arrays. My skin had that grayish quality common to men who spend their lives bathed in electromagnetic radiation, and my hands trembled slightly even at rest, a side effect of neural interface exposure that connected my nervous system directly to the sensor grids for 8 hours every shift. I had served for a decade, monitoring the void for threats that might emerge from the warp or the dark spaces between stars. I was good at my work. I took pride in the vigilance that kept 300 million souls safe while they labored in the vast manufactorums that produced munitions for wars I would never see, on worlds whose names I would never learn. The morning the Necrons came, I was drinking recaf that tasted like burned metal and reviewing overnight sensor logs in Station Tertius. 9, a monitoring hub built into the side of Hive Primus at the 3,000-meter mark. The air in the station carried that particular smell of long occupation, stale sweat, ozone from overworked equipment, the faint chemical sweetness of nutrient paste that formed the bulk of our rations, and underneath it all, the ever-present scent of machine oil that seeped from every surface in a forge world. The temperature held steady at 18 degrees Celsius, cold enough that we wore our greatcoats even indoors, our breath sometimes visible in the dim red lighting that characterized all Imperial monitoring stations. I had 47 men under my direct command in that station. I knew their names, their habits, their complaints. Guardsman Hetrick, who had lost 3 fingers to frostbite during a winter posting on the Polar Monitoring Array but refused medical discharge. Sergeant Callus, 20 years my senior, who had fought in the Damocles Crusade and still woke screaming from dreams of Fire Warrior pulse rifles. Junior Sensorium Officer Prentice, barely 19, who wrote letters to a mother on a hive world 12 sectors distant and never received replies because the administratum had misrouted his correspondence for 7 years running. These were my men. I was responsible for their survival, for their vigilance, for ensuring they maintained the watch that kept the world turning. The shift had begun at 0600 hours, standard Imperial time. By 0847, when the first anomaly registered, I had already consumed 3 cups of recaf and reviewed 17 routine sensor logs, showing nothing but the expected traffic patterns. Ore haulers ascending from the deep mines, atmospheric processors cycling their eternal work, defense satellites maintaining their programmed orbits. The galaxy was as it should be. Vast, hostile, but predictable within the parameters we had spent 10,000 years learning to measure. The anomaly began as a subsonic vibration that I felt through the metal deck plating before any instrument registered it. A thrumming deep in the bones, like standing next to a massive engine cycling up to full power. Hetrick felt it too. I saw him look up from his station, his remaining fingers pausing over his input keys, his face registering the same confused concern that I felt rising in my chest. The vibration built slowly, increasing in intensity over 30 seconds, until my teeth ached from it, and the recaf in my cup showed ripples spreading across its surface like a tiny pond disturbed by something moving beneath. Then every Auspex screen in the station went dead. Not flickering, not showing static or interference patterns, just black, empty, displaying nothing at all despite every indicator showing the systems were receiving power and functioning normally. 300 screens across the monitoring hub went dark simultaneously, and in that moment, I experienced the first touch of the fear that would define my final hours as something recognizably human. "Sir?" Callus was already moving toward my command station, his hand instinctively dropping to the las pistol at his hip, 20 years of combat experience telling him that impossible things meant danger. "What's the status?" I was running diagnostics before he finished speaking, my fingers moving through command sequences I had performed 10,000 times. Neural interface connecting me directly to the station's machine spirit so I could feel the systems responding, functioning, finding nothing wrong with themselves even as they showed me nothing but emptiness. The Auspex arrays were operational. The Vox channels were clear. Every subsystem reported green status. And yet we were blind, deaf, cut off from the sensor network that was our entire purpose for existing. "Unknown," I said, and my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "All systems report functional, but we're not receiving any data. It's as if the lights changed. Our dim red emergency lighting suddenly washed out, replaced by something else. Something that came from outside the station, filtering through the reinforced viewports that looked out over the hive sprawl below. Green light, cold and bright, the color of something that had never been alive and never would be. It rose from the ground itself, from 1,000 points across the planetary surface. Pillars of emerald radiance that climbed into the sky like searchlight beams, but wrong, moving with purpose, sweeping across the landscape in patterns too precise to be natural. I moved to the viewport, pressing my face against the armor cries to see better, and what I witnessed in those first moments would have been beautiful if it hadn't been so absolutely terrifying. The green light was coming from structures that were emerging from beneath the surface, not breaking through like something excavating or drilling, but phasing into existence as if the ground and everything built upon it were merely projections that could be dismissed when no longer convenient. Pyramidal shapes, black metal that seemed to absorb light except where green energy traced geometric patterns across their surfaces, rising from the earth in complete silence across every horizon I could see. They were vast. One structure rose less than 2 kilometers from Hive Primus, a pyramid of black stone or metal, I couldn't tell which, that climbed 300 meters into the air in the span of 30 seconds, displacing nothing, destroying nothing, simply existing where moments before there had been only standard Imperial infrastructure and hab blocks. No sound accompanied its emergence. No rumbling of earth or shriek of tearing metal. Just silence and that cold green light that made my eyes hurt to look at directly. "Holy Throne," Callus whispered beside me, and I heard genuine terror in his voice, something I had never heard from a man who had fought Tau and lived. "What are they?" I didn't answer because I didn't know. My training included recognition protocols for every known Xenos threat in Imperial records. Orc invasion signatures, Tyranid bioship profiles, Chaos corruption markers, even the rare Eldari raiding patterns. But this matched nothing in our databases. Nothing in any briefing I had ever received. The structures were too perfect, too geometrically precise, too obviously artificial, but in a way that predated anything I understood about technology. They looked ancient and advanced simultaneously, as if they had been built by something that understood principles of reality that humanity had never discovered. If this glimpse of what emerged from Tertium 7's depths already fills you with dread, witness what comes next. Leave the word "harvested" in the comments below. The Vox channels suddenly exploded with traffic. Not the organized military communication protocols we maintained, but raw panic from 100 different sources across the planet. Civilian channels, military frequencies, even the sacred communication bands reserved for tech priest communion with the Omnisire. Everyone was seeing what we were seeing, and everyone was trying to understand it simultaneously. Emerged from the requesting immediate evacuation protocols. In the Emperor's name, what are those things? 3 million casualties in Sector 14. They just appeared inside the Entire battalion gone, sir. They were there and then they weren't. Just green light and... I grabbed the Vox control at my station, trying to restore order to the chaos, trying to reach the command hierarchy that would tell us what to do, how to respond, what these structures meant. But even as I opened the command channel, I saw movement at the base of the nearest pyramid. Figures emerging, walking out of the structure, as if passing through a doorway, except there was no doorway visible. Just solid black metal until suddenly there wasn't, and something was stepping through. They were humanoid in the way that a statue is humanoid. The right proportions, the right arrangement of limbs and torso and head, but wrong in every detail that mattered. Metal skeletons that moved with precision no human could achieve. Green fire burning in their eye sockets and chest cavities, carrying weapons that looked like nothing in Imperial arsenals. They moved in perfect unison, dozens of them, then hundreds, then thousands, spreading out from the pyramid's base in geometric patterns that covered ground with mathematical efficiency. Battle stations, I said, but my voice felt distant, disconnected from the reality of what I was seeing. All personnel to battle stations. Prepare to defend the station. The words were meaningless. We were a monitoring post, not a fortress. We had 47 men, a dozen lasguns, and faith in the Emperor's protection. The things emerging from the pyramids numbered in the tens of thousands just in the sector I could see, and more pyramids were rising across every horizon. But we were Imperial Guard, and we had our duty, and if we were going to die, and I already knew with certainty that we were, then we would die doing our duty. The metal skeletons didn't attack. That was what made no sense, what violated every pattern of Xenos invasion I had ever studied. They simply spread out across the landscape in organized groups, moving with purpose toward population centers, toward hab blocks and manufacturums and transit stations. They carried their weapons but didn't raise them. They advanced but didn't charge. They exhibited all the hallmarks of military organization, but none of the aggression that characterized warfare. I watched through magnocular lenses as one group of approximately 20 skeletons entered a hab block 300 meters from our position. I expected screaming, expected lass fire from the Arbites who maintained order in the civilian sectors, expected some sign of resistance or combat. Instead, 3 minutes later, the skeletons emerged escorting a column of civilians, men, women, children, all walking calmly, too calmly, as if they were taking a leisurely stroll rather than being marched out by nightmarish Xenos constructs. Their faces showed no expression at all. Their movements were synchronized in a way that human movement never is, each person stepping in time with those around them, all of them moving toward the pyramid with mechanical precision. "They're taking them alive," Prentice said, his young voice cracking with incomprehension. "Why are they taking them alive?" I had no answer. Xenos killed. That was the fundamental truth we learned about the galaxy. Humanity's enemies sought our destruction, our consumption, our corruption. They didn't take prisoners for later release. They didn't organize civilian populations into orderly columns and march them peacefully into alien structures. They killed, because that's what threats to the Imperium did. But these things, these metal skeletons with their cold green fire and their perfect precision, weren't killing. They were collecting, harvesting, processing people like we processed raw materials in the manufacturums, with the same mechanical efficiency, the same absence of emotion or hesitation. And somehow that was more terrifying than any battlefield slaughter I could imagine. The counterattack was ordered at 092, 3 hours, 36 minutes after the first pyramid emerged. I monitored it from my station, tracking the Imperial response through Auspex returns that had suddenly started working again, as if whatever had blinded our senses had decided we were permitted to watch what came next. 3 armored columns, approximately 400 vehicles total, converged on the largest pyramid complex in Hive Primus from 3 directions. Lehman Russ battle tanks, Chimera transports, artillery batteries that had been positioned for planetary defense against orbital assault. 15,000 troops, the flower of Tertium VII's garrison, committed to a single decisive blow against the invaders. I watched the engagement through multiple feeds: visual, thermal, auspex, vox communication. I watched our tanks open fire at maximum range. Lascannon beams and battle cannon shells crossing 2 kilometers of devastated urban landscape to impact against the metal skeletons that had formed defensive positions around the pyramid. I watched our shells detonate, our last beams strike home, and I watched the targeting reticles on my screens mark confirmed hits with the precision that 10,000 years of Imperial warfare had perfected. Then I watched those same enemies stand up from positions where they should have been vaporized, their metal bodies showing minor damage that repaired itself in seconds, green energy flowing over the wounds like liquid metal, restoring what our weapons had destroyed. I watched them raise their own weapons and return fire with weapons that didn't shoot projectiles or beams, but rather pulses of green lightning that unmade whatever they touched. A Layman Russ battle tank, 58 tons of blessed armor and sanctified machinery, simply ceased to exist when that lightning touched it, not exploded. Not destroyed, just gone, along with its 4-man crew, as if they had never been there at all. The battle lasted 7 minutes. 15,000 men reduced to 3,000, then 1,000, then scattered survivors fleeing into the ruins while the metal skeletons advanced with that same terrible precision, not pursuing, just reclaiming the ground and organizing the survivors into columns for collection. The Vox channels carried screaming now, carried desperate prayers to the Emperor who wasn't answering, carried the last words of men who had believed the Imperium made them strong enough to face anything the galaxy could present. Mordros. The voice came from my personal Vox feed, Command Channel Priority Alpha. General Hatek, overall commander of Tertium VII's defense forces. What's your status? Operational, sir, I responded automatically, though the word felt meaningless. Station Tertius. 9 has not been directly engaged. We maintain full sensor coverage of sectors 14 through 22. Good. I need you to maintain that coverage. We're pulling back to the spaceport, attempting evacuation of essential personnel and critical industrial materiel. The enemy is spreading across every population center on the planet simultaneously. We can't hold them. We can't even slow them down. But we need to understand what they're doing, Warden. We need data before this world falls completely. The general's voice carried resignation that terrified me more than the metal skeletons themselves. This was a man who had held this world against an Orc war 8 years prior, who had personally led counterattacks against 3 separate chaos incursions. If he was talking about evacuation after 36 minutes of contact, then the situation was even worse than the evidence of my own eyes suggested. Understood, sir. We'll maintain the watch. The Emperor protects. Warden. The Emperor protects, I echoed. But the words tasted like ash in my mouth because I could see 47 pyramids from my viewport, and none of them showed any sign that the Emperor's protection was reaching this world. The hours that followed taught me what efficiency truly meant. The metal skeletons moved through Hive Primus in organized groups, sweeping hab blocks with mathematical precision. They entered buildings and emerged minutes later with columns of civilians who walked with that same disturbing synchronization, all expression erased from their faces, all individual movement replaced with collective purpose. They were marched to the pyramids and taken inside, and what happened to them within those structures I couldn't see, because no sensor I possessed could penetrate that black metal. But I could count. I had 40 years of experience managing data flows, tracking logistics, calculating rates and projections. I could count the civilians entering the pyramids, could estimate based on observed rates of collection, could project forward using nothing but mathematics and horror. The numbers were impossible. The numbers suggested that the metal skeletons were processing, not killing, processing approximately 40,000 people per hour per pyramid. There were 73 pyramids visible from my station alone. Extrapolating across the planet based on reported contacts, I estimated 300 pyramids total. 300 pyramids, 40,000 people per hour. 300 million planetary population. The math was simple and terrible. 8 hours. They would empty Tertium-7 of human life in approximately 8 hours at current rates. And they had already demonstrated the capacity to maintain those rates, without pause, without rest, without any of the logistical constraints that would limit human operations. Sir, Callus had been running his own calculations, coming to the same horrible conclusion. At this rate, by nightfall, I know, we have to get off planet. Where? I gestured at the screens showing orbital space, showing the defense satellites that weren't responding to any commands, showing the 6 Navy destroyers in high orbit that had also gone silent. The Navy's not answering. The spaceport reports half its landing pads are occupied by those pyramids. General Hatek is trying to organize evacuation. But evacuation to where? They came from underground, Callus. They were already here, sleeping beneath our feet while we built our cities and our lives on top of their graves. The old sergeant's face showed the same expression I felt twisting my own features. The recognition that we had already lost, that the battle had been decided before we knew there was a battle, that everything we thought we controlled had been illusion granted by something that could withdraw that illusion whenever it chose. At 11:47 hours, a group of the metal skeletons approached Station Tertius 9. I watched them through external cameras, tracking their precise movement through the ruins of Hab Sector 7. Their weapons held in identical positions, their steps synchronized to the centimeter. They moved like components in a machine, like gears turning in perfect mesh, and I understood with sudden, horrible clarity that they weren't individuals at all. They were extensions of something else, something vast, operating through these metal bodies, the way I operated through my neural interface. Consciousness distributed across multiple platforms, single purpose expressed through coordinated action. Defensive positions, I ordered, knowing it was futile but maintaining the forms anyway because we were Imperial Guard and we had procedures, and if we abandoned those, we had nothing left. Prepare to repel borders. My 47 men took their positions with the discipline of trained soldiers. Last guns charged, limited ammunition distributed to firing positions, door barricades reinforced with whatever materials we could requisition. We had done this 100 times in drills. Preparing for the theoretical enemy who might assault our station, following protocols that assumed enemies died when you shot them, and could be held off with sufficient firepower and determination. The metal skeletons didn't breach the doors. They walked through the walls. One moment, the reinforced plasteel that formed our station's exterior was solid and impenetrable. The next moment, green light flowed across its surface, and 20 metal skeletons stepped through it as if it were mist, their eye sockets burning with that cold emerald fire, their weapons tracked on my men with mathematical precision. "Fire!" Callus screamed, and 47 lasguns opened up in the confined space of the station, last beams crossing the 50 meters between defensive positions and invaders, striking home with precision that would have made any weapons instructor proud. The metal skeletons absorbed the last fire without apparent damage. I watched beams that should have melted through armor plate strike their metal bodies and dissipate as if hitting some kind of energy field or phasing in and out of reality, never quite achieving solid contact. They didn't return fire. They just stood there, letting us empty our weapon charges into them, waiting with the patience of things that had already waited 60 million years and could wait another 60,000 if necessary. When the last fire finally stopped, weapons exhausted, power packs drained, the skeletons moved. Not rushing, not charging, just walking forward with that same mechanical precision, reaching out with metal hands that closed around my men with strength that crumpled flak armor like parchment. I heard screaming, heard Prentice calling for his mother, heard Callus trying to organize a retreat that had nowhere to retreat to. Then the green light flowed over them all, and the screaming stopped. Not because they died, I could see they were still standing, still breathing, still alive, but because something had taken control of their nervous systems, had imposed that same terrible synchronization I had seen in the collected civilians. My men's faces went blank. Their movements became coordinated. They turned as one unit and began walking toward the wall, toward the places where green light had dissolved solid matter into something permeable. I tried to stop them, tried to grab Callus, tried to pull him back from whatever had taken control of his mind. My hands closed on his arm, and he looked at me without recognition, his eyes seeing but not seeing. Conscious but not conscious, something else looking through his pupils at me with the cold calculation of a machine spirit, categorizing components. "No," I said, but it came out as a whisper, as if my voice had forgotten how to project command. "No, you can't have them." One of the metal skeletons turned its head toward me, not quickly, but with deliberate precision, as if I had been marked for special attention. It walked toward me while my men filed past into the wall's green dissolution, walked until it stood close enough that I could see the intricate detail of its construction, could see the way its metal bones were engraved with symbols that hurt my eyes to look at directly, could feel the cold that radiated from it like winter given form. It raised one hand and placed it on my chest, and I felt my body lock in place, every muscle freezing, as if my nervous system had been replaced with a switch that someone else controlled. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight. I wanted to pray to the Emperor for salvation. But I could do none of those things because I no longer had control of my own flesh. The metal skeleton tilted its head, studying me the way a tech priest might study a promising component. And then it did something that made no sound but that I felt through my bones and my teeth and the base of my skull. It was scanning me, reading me, extracting data from my brain through means I couldn't understand. I felt my memories being accessed like files in a data core, felt the metal skeleton rifling through my thoughts and experiences with the same casual efficiency it had shown collecting civilians from hab blocks. It learned my name, my rank, my training, my expertise with sensor arrays and data analysis. It learned that I was good at mathematics, at pattern recognition, at managing information flows. It learned that I was useful, and that recognition saved me from immediate collection, while simultaneously damning me to something worse. The skeleton released me, and control returned to my body in a rush that made me collapse to the floor, gasping for air I hadn't realized I'd been holding. It walked past me, following my men through the wall, leaving me alone in Station Tertius. 9, with all its screens still showing the systematic harvesting of Tertium-7's 300 million souls. Let your like acknowledge what Kelvin Mordros witnessed. A harvest without mercy, precise and total. I should have followed. Should have let them take me with my men, should have accepted collection and whatever came after. But I didn't. I sat in my command chair and I watched the screens and I counted, because counting was what I did. Because understanding the scale of horror was somehow easier than accepting I had been left behind while my men were taken. By 1600 hours, the pyramids had processed an estimated 120 million people. The evacuations from the spaceport had been halted when pyramids emerged directly beneath 3 transport ships, phasing into existence through the landing pads and absorbing the vessels and their 10,000 passengers into black metal depths. General Haratek stopped responding to Vox hails at 1623 hours. The orbital navy went silent at 1644 hours. By 1700 hours, resistance had ceased across the entire planet, not because defenders had been killed, but because defenders had been collected, processed, taken into the pyramids for purposes I could only imagine, and desperately tried not to. I sat in my station, and I watched Tertium-7 die. Not through violence, not through the fire and blood that characterized Imperial warfare, but through this cold, methodical collection that somehow felt more obscene than any slaughter. The metal skeletons moved through the ruins with perfect precision, gathering every human they found, organizing them into columns, marching them into the pyramids. They ignored vehicles. They ignored equipment. They ignored the carefully constructed infrastructure of Imperial civilization. They took only the people, only the living biomass that had value for whatever purposes drove their ancient machine logic. By 2000 hours, The streets were empty. I could see it on every camera, every external sensor, every viewport that showed the landscape below. Tertium 7, a world that had housed 300 million souls just 12 hours earlier, was silent and abandoned. The hab blocks stood intact but vacant. The manufactorums still hummed with automated processes that hadn't realized their operators were gone. The lights still burned in windows that looked out on nothing, on empty streets where no footsteps would ever sound again. The pyramids stood in the darkness like black teeth against the sky, their green light pulsing in patterns I couldn't read, but that suggested communication, data transfer, completion of some programmed objective. They had come. They had collected. They had harvested 300 million people in 8 hours and 17 minutes. And they had done it with an efficiency that would have made any Imperial logistics officer weep with envy if any Imperial logistics officers still existed on this world. I was alone. I understood that now. Understood that I had been left behind deliberately. That the metal skeleton that had scanned me had marked me as something other than immediate collection. I didn't know why. Didn't know what purpose I might serve to things that could empty a world of life in less time than it took to complete a standard work shift. But I was alone, and the silence was absolute. And the green light from the pyramids painted my station in colors that made my shadow look like something that didn't belong to me anymore. At 22:47 hours, the pyramids began to descend. Not violently, not with the same dramatic emergence that had marked their arrival, but with that same casual dissolution of physical law that characterized everything about these creatures. They simply sank back into the earth, phasing through solid matter as if the centuries of imperial construction and the millennia of geological formation meant nothing to them. Within 30 minutes, every pyramid had vanished, leaving behind only smooth, crater-like depressions in the earth and the empty cities they had harvested clean. I thought it was over, thought they had taken what they wanted and returned to whatever depths they came from, their nightmare efficiency applied and completed and forgotten. I thought I had survived, that whatever had marked me as separate from the collected masses meant I would live to report what had happened here, to warn other worlds about what slept beneath their feet, to testify to the Imperium about a threat that matched nothing in our xenological databases. I was wrong about everything. The metal skeletons that had scanned me returned at 01:13, 4 hours the following morning. I had been sitting in my command chair for 19 consecutive hours, watching empty screens showing empty streets, my mind trying to process what I had witnessed and failing, because the scale was too vast, the horror too absolute. I heard them before I saw them, that subsonic vibration again, that feeling of massive engines cycling up somewhere beneath the earth. Then the wall dissolved and a dozen of them walked through, moving with that same precise coordination, and I knew with certainty that my brief reprieve had ended. They didn't speak. I don't know if they could speak, if they had anything approximating vocal systems, or if communication through sound was beneath their notice. But one of them approached me and placed its metal hand on my chest again, and this time when the scanning sensation washed through my nervous system, it didn't stop. It kept going, deeper and deeper, like hooks being set in my consciousness, like tendrils of cold logic wrapping around every synapse in my brain. Then I was somewhere else. Not physically. My body remained in the command chair. I could still feel the pressure of the armrests under my palms, still smell the stale air of the station. But my consciousness had been pulled elsewhere, dragged into some kind of network or communication matrix that existed in the metal skeleton's internal systems. I could feel other minds there, could sense vast processing power surrounding me like an ocean, ancient and cold and utterly inhuman. And I could hear them. Not words, not language as humans understood it, but direct transfer of meaning. Concepts flowing into my mind with crystal clarity, despite my brain's desperate attempts to reject what it was receiving. Purpose, cataloging. Function, biotransference experiment continuation. Status, harvest successful. 300 million specimens collected. Stasis protocols engaged. genetic diversity preserved for analysis. I tried to scream, but my body wasn't responding to my commands anymore. I tried to look away, but vision in this place wasn't something controlled by eyes or muscles. I was drowning in their logic, in their cold calculations, in the understanding of what they had done and why they had done it, and what they planned to do with the 300 million souls they had taken. They hadn't killed anyone. That was the horror that my mind kept returning to, kept trying to comprehend and failing. They hadn't killed a single human being during the entire harvesting operation. Every person collected was alive, was preserved in some kind of stasis field, deep within whatever spaces existed beneath Tertium-7's crust. They were being stored like samples in a biologist laboratory, like specimens awaiting examination, like raw materials for experiments that would begin when these ancient machines decided they had sufficient data for whatever purpose drove their emotionless logic. Biotransference. The word meant nothing to me, but the concept that came with it was clear enough. These metal skeletons had once been organic themselves, had undergone some process that transferred their consciousness from flesh into metal, from life into this eternal undeath that preserved awareness while stripping away everything that made life worth having. And they were studying humanity, studying us to understand our biology, our consciousness, our potential for undergoing the same process that had damned them 60 million years before the Emperor walked on Terra. Subject Mordros Kelvin designated Observer. Function: continue monitoring. Await further instruction. Duration: indefinite. Then I was back in my own head, back in my body, gasping and shaking and feeling like I had been drowning in ice water for hours. The metal skeletons were already leaving, walking back through the wall, their purpose completed. They had told me what I was now: an observer, a witness, something they were leaving behind to watch and report and understand the full scope of what had been done to this world. I didn't understand why. Didn't understand what purpose I served by being left alive and aware while everyone else had been collected. But I was learning that understanding was perhaps the cruelest gift these creatures could give. Because understanding meant I knew exactly what had happened to my men, to the 300 million souls of Tertium-7, to everyone I had ever known or served beside or protected. They were alive. They were stored in perfect stasis, in whatever spaces existed beneath my feet. And they would remain there for years or centuries or millennia, preserved samples awaiting examination by things that measured time in geological epochs and considered human lifespan to be a rounding error in their calculations. The days that followed existed in a kind of surreal horror that I have no adequate words to describe. I remained in Station Tertius 9 because there was nowhere else to go, no other survivors to seek out, no rescue coming from a navy that had been collected along with everyone else. I had food in the station stores sufficient for 6 months. I had water recyclers that would function for years. I had power cells that would last decades. I could survive in this empty station on this empty world for the rest of my natural life, watching empty streets through empty screens, the last human on a planet that had been harvested clean of humanity. But I wasn't alone. That was the second horror, the understanding that came slowly over those first days of isolation. The metal skeletons would return periodically, phasing through the walls to observe me, to scan me, to ensure I was fulfilling my designated function as observer and witness. They never spoke, never acknowledged my desperate attempts to communicate, to beg for information about my men, to understand what they planned to do with the harvested populations. They just watched, the same way I watched the empty streets. 2 types of observers studying 2 types of absence. Me studying the absence of life, them studying the presence of continued existence under conditions of absolute isolation. Subscribe if you dare to understand what comes next. The truth of storage, the horror of patience, the mathematics of eternal waiting. At some point, I lost track of when, time becoming fluid in the absence of any meaningful events to mark its passage, I began to understand what I was really observing. The metal skeletons weren't keeping me alive out of mercy or curiosity. They were conducting an experiment, measuring how human consciousness degraded under conditions of complete isolation, studying the psychological effects of being the sole survivor of planetary harvest. I was a sample, just like everyone in the stasis chambers below, except my prison was consciousness rather than frozen time, awareness rather than preservation. I tried to maintain routines, woke at 060 hours standard Imperial time, despite the fact that day and night had ceased to have meaning. Consumed nutrient paste at regulation intervals, ran diagnostics on sensor arrays that showed nothing but empty cities and patient metal skeletons. Wrote reports that no one would ever read, documenting the continued silence of Tertium-7, recording my observations for the administrative clerks who would never come to retrieve them. But the routines fell apart gradually, the way everything does when maintained only by individual will, in the absence of any external structure. I stopped shaving, stopped changing my uniform, stopped sleeping in the barracks bunk, and instead collapsed in the command chair when exhaustion finally overwhelmed my determination to maintain discipline. Months passed. I think months. The station chronometer continued to function, but I found myself caring less and less about what numbers it displayed. The metal skeletons continued their observations. Sometimes they would stand in the station for hours, completely motionless, their green eyes fixed on me with that mathematical precision that suggested they were recording everything, measuring everything, comparing my degradation to baseline data extracted from whatever scans they had performed when they first marked me for this purpose. I tried to ignore them, tried to maintain my humanity in the face of their inhuman attention. But how do you maintain humanity when humanity consists of you alone on a dead world? When every person you ever knew is frozen in stasis beneath your feet, when your purpose has become serving as a data point in experiments conducted by things that don't acknowledge your existence beyond your utility as a specimen? The answer is that you don't. You can't. Humanity isn't something that exists in isolation. It requires contact, connection, the constant reinforcement of shared experience and mutual recognition. Take that away, and what remains might look human, might move and speak and think in human patterns, but it's something else, something hollow, something that goes through the motions because it doesn't know what else to do. I stopped writing reports at some point, stopped running diagnostics, stopped maintaining routines that had lost all meaning. I sat in the command chair and stared at the screens showing empty streets. And sometimes the metal skeletons would come and scan me, and sometimes they wouldn't. And I couldn't remember anymore which condition was worse, being studied like an insect under a lens, or being alone with thoughts that circled endlessly around the same horror. 300 million people in stasis, my men among them. Callous, Hetrick, young prentice who would never receive his mother's letters. All of them frozen in the moment of collection, their consciousness preserved but inactive, waiting for whatever examination or experimentation the metal skeletons had planned. Would they wake them? Would they extract their minds for study, the way they had extracted information from mine? Would they attempt biotransference, trying to map human consciousness onto metal frameworks, testing whether humanity could be preserved through the same process that had created these ancient machines? I didn't know. The metal skeletons didn't share their plans, didn't explain their purpose beyond the bare minimum transferred during that first neural scan. I was left to speculate, to imagine, to construct increasingly horrific scenarios in a mind that had nothing else to occupy it but horror. The isolation did things to my perception. I began to see patterns in the green light that pulsed periodically from the sites where pyramids had stood. Mathematical progressions in the timing of the metal skeletons' visits. Significance in the way empty buildings caught the starlight from the planet's unchanged sky. My brain, desperate for meaning and meaninglessness, invented structures and purposes where none existed, tried to impose narrative on events that operated according to logic I couldn't comprehend. I talked to myself, long conversations with Callus, asking his advice on matters that no longer mattered, shouted questions at the metal skeletons during their observations, demanding answers they would never provide, gave names to the empty streets visible from my viewport, created imaginary populations to replace the real ones that had been harvested, told myself stories about where they had gone and what they were doing now in their frozen sleep. The sensor arrays reported something at month 7, or what I thought was month 7, time having become increasingly abstract. Orbital traffic. Ships dropping out of the warp at the system's edge, Imperial Navy by their signatures, a rescue fleet come to investigate why Tertium-7 had stopped responding to regular communications. I watched them approach the planet, watched them achieve orbit, watched them begin scanning for survivors. I tried to vox them, tried to broadcast on every Imperial frequency I could access, tried to warn them about what waited below, about the metal skeletons and the pyramids and the harvesting mechanisms that could empty a world of life in 8 hours. But my transmissions went nowhere, were absorbed or blocked by technology I couldn't detect, as if the empty air between my station and the orbital ships had become impermeable to electromagnetic radiation. I watched the Navy ships descend, watched them deploy ground forces to investigate the empty cities, watched those forces spread out in standard reconnaissance patterns, professional and cautious, and completely unprepared for what waited in the depths. Then I watched the pyramids rise again, faster this time because they had done this before, had practiced their harvesting protocols and improved their efficiency. The naval forces lasted 4 hours, 12,000 additional samples for the stasis chambers, 12,000 more souls stored for examination in some future that might be tomorrow or might be 10 million years hence. The ships tried to escape, tried to burn for orbit and make the transition to warp space that would carry them beyond the reach of the metal skeletons. But green light speared up from the planet's surface, and the ships that touched that light simply stopped, their engines dying, their machine spirits silenced, their crews collected in the same methodical fashion that had claimed everyone else. The wrecks remained in orbit, empty monuments to failed rescue, warning beacons that no one would be able to hear. Comment eternal if you understand there is no escape, no rescue. Only the patient mathematics of harvesting resumed whenever convenient. After that, I stopped hoping, stopped imagining scenarios where someone would come, where the Imperium would send forces sufficient to combat the metal skeletons, where anything I did or said would matter in any meaningful way. I understood what I was now, a bookmark in an experiment that would outlast my natural lifespan, a measuring stick for psychological degradation, a specimen preserved through consciousness rather than stasis but serving the same purpose. The metal skeletons continued their observations with the same patient precision they applied to everything. They didn't care that I had stopped maintaining myself, stopped eating regularly, stopped performing any of the functions that had characterized my previous existence. They just recorded the changes, documented the degradation, compared my declining state to whatever baseline measurements they had established. I tried to die, tried to refuse food until starvation took me, tried to override life support systems to fill the station with vacuum or toxic atmosphere. But the metal skeletons wouldn't permit it. They would appear whenever my vital signs dropped below some threshold they had determined, would force nutrients into my system through means I couldn't prevent, would repair whatever damage I had managed to inflict on myself. I wasn't allowed to die because death would end the experiment, would remove their measurement tool, would invalidate whatever data they were collecting from my continued existence. So I existed, not lived. Existence and life were different conditions, and I had long since passed the threshold that separated them. I sat in the command chair in Station Tertius, 9 on the empty world of Tertium-7, and I watched empty screens, and I waited for whatever conclusion the metal skeletons had programmed into their experimental protocols. Years passed, I think years. The chronometer continued its function, but the numbers had ceased to correlate with any meaningful experience. My body aged, despite the metal skeleton's interventions, gravity and time doing their work even when starvation was prevented. My hair went gray, then white, then began to fall out in patches. My skin developed the texture of old parchment, dry and thin, and marked with age spots that multiplied like constellations across my arms and hands. My vision degraded, objects becoming indistinct at distances that had once been clear, words on screens blurring until I had to squint to read diagnostic data that no longer mattered. But my mind remained sharp. That was their doing, I understood. They kept my consciousness functional even as my body degraded, kept me aware and observing and fulfilling my designated purpose. They needed the data my continued experience provided, needed to measure how human awareness coped with decades of isolation, needed to document the slow erosion of everything that had made me Kelvin Mordros, Sensorium Warden, Imperial Guard, servant of the Emperor. The Emperor. I hadn't thought about him in years, hadn't prayed or invoked his protection, or called upon the faith that had sustained me through a decade of military service. The metal skeletons had taught me the futility of prayer more effectively than any heretic ever could. They had shown me that faith was irrelevant to creatures that measured time in geological epochs, that prayers went unheard by things that didn't acknowledge human consciousness beyond its utility as experimental data. That protection was a lie we told ourselves to maintain the illusion of significance in a galaxy that regarded humanity as nothing more than interesting specimens for collection and study. The metal skeletons stopped coming at some point in what the chronometer assured me was the 43rd year of my observation. No warning, no final scan or communication, just absence where their periodic visits had once provided the only external event in my existence. The station remained functional, power cells still charged, life support still cycled atmosphere, nutrient paste still dispensed from automated systems that operated without need for human oversight. But the observers were gone, their experiment apparently complete, their data collected, their purpose satisfied. I should have felt relief, should have celebrated the end of their attention, the conclusion of whatever study they had conducted, using my degradation as their primary data source. Instead, I felt only greater emptiness, as if their observation had been the last thread connecting me to anything beyond the walls of Station Tertius. 9. And with that thread severed, I was truly alone in a way I hadn't been even during the decades of isolation. The chronometer reached 50 years. My body had become a collection of failing systems, held together by the metal skeleton's interventions and the station's automated medical protocols. I could barely walk, my muscles atrophied from decades of minimal movement. My vision had degraded to the point where screens were useless blurs, unless I pressed my face within centimeters of the display. My hands shook constantly, tremors that made even simple tasks require concentration and multiple attempts. But I still sat in the command chair, still watched the empty streets through viewports that showed cities slowly succumbing to nature's patient reclamation. Plants grew through pavement cracks, weather-eroded buildings that had once housed millions. The orderly grid of imperial construction gradually dissolved into organic chaos, as decades of abandonment allowed Tertium-7 to forget it had ever been touched by human habitation. And beneath it all, in chambers I couldn't see but knew existed, 300 million souls remained in perfect stasis, unchanged and unchanging, waiting for something that might never come, or might come tomorrow, or might come in another 60 million years when the metal skeletons completed whatever vast and incomprehensible project occupied their ancient calculations. I thought about them constantly, thought about Callus frozen in the moment of collection, his expression blank, but his mind preserved, aware or unaware depending on how the stasis technology functioned. Thought about young Prentice, 19 forever, letters to his mother never delivered, life never lived beyond that moment when green light had taken control of his nervous system. Thought about General Haratek and the Navy crews and every civilian who had been collected rather than killed, stored rather than destroyed. Were they experiencing anything in their stasis? Did time pass for them, subjective eternities trapped in frozen consciousness, unable to move or speak or do anything but exist in whatever mental space the preservation technology permitted? Or was it truly suspension, awareness switched off, nothing experienced until the moment they were awakened, if they were ever awakened? I didn't know, would never know, could only speculate in the endless hours of existence that comprised my designated purpose. The chronometer reached 72 years. My body was failing in ways the automated systems couldn't compensate for anymore. Organs breaking down, cellular structures collapsing, biological systems reaching the end of their programmed lifespan despite every intervention. I could feel death approaching with the same mathematical certainty the metal skeletons had shown in everything they did. Days, perhaps weeks, but not months. Not years. I should have felt fear. Should have raged against the dying of the light, the way imperial doctrine claimed all faithful servants did. But I felt only a kind of distant relief, as if death was the completion of some formula, the final data point in the experiment the metal skeletons had conducted using my existence as their primary variable. Like if you recognize that death was never escape, only the transformation from one kind of specimen to another. On what the chronometer assured me was the 72nd anniversary of the harvest. I had been maintaining that count despite abandoning all others, some desperate need to mark the significance of that day. I felt the subsonic vibration again for the first time in decades. That familiar thrumming in the bones, that sensation of massive engines cycling up from depths that exceeded any human excavation. The metal skeletons were coming back, and I understood with clarity that comes at the end of things that they had been waiting for this moment, for my death, for the conclusion of their observation. They emerged through the wall with the same precision they had always shown. Different bodies, I could tell by the minor variations in their construction, by the specific patterns etched into their metal frames, but the same purpose, the same cold calculation behind their burning green eyes. One of them approached my command chair, where I sat wrapped in blankets despite the station's regulated temperature, my body unable to maintain thermal equilibrium anymore, death very close now. It placed its hand on my chest, and I felt that scanning sensation one final time. But this time was different. This time, instead of extracting information, it was writing something. Loading data directly into my degrading neural tissue, forcing concepts into my dying brain, with the same efficiency it had shown collecting civilians 72 years before. And I understood. Finally understood the full scope of what they had done, what they were still doing, what they would continue to do for as long as stars burned and galaxies turned. The harvesting wasn't about biotransference experiments, wasn't about studying humanity for eventual transformation. It was about preservation. The metal skeletons, Necrons, they called themselves, though the name was loaded with cultural context that my human mind couldn't fully process, had once been organic like us, had undergone biotransference and discovered too late that they had traded everything that made existence meaningful for eternal function without purpose. They couldn't reverse the process, couldn't reclaim the organic existence they had lost. But they could preserve it, could collect samples of biological life and store them in perfect stasis, could maintain vast genetic libraries across thousands of worlds against some future need or purpose they hadn't yet determined. Tertium-7 was just one collection among thousands, 300 million specimens from a species that showed interesting characteristics: adaptability, resilience, technological advancement despite relative youth in galactic terms. We were being studied, yes, but not for immediate experimentation. We were being stored, catalogued, preserved like samples in a biologist's vault, maintained in perfect stasis until some future point when the Necrons decided our genetics or consciousness or biological structures had utility for purposes they were still calculating. And I was the bookmark, the observer, the consciousness left behind to document what happened to worlds after harvesting, to measure the long-term effects of removing human populations from Imperial territory, to provide data points about how the Imperium responded to such losses, and how quickly those responses arrived, and what strategies they employed. I was a sensor array, just as I had always been, still fulfilling my original function, but now for masters who measured success in timescales that made human history into a rounding error. The Necron removed its hand from my chest, and I felt my consciousness starting to fragment, felt death finally reaching the vital systems that had sustained me for 72 years beyond any reasonable human lifespan. I was dying, the experiment concluding, the data collection complete. But before I went, the Necron gave me one final gift, a glimpse of the network, of the vast computational matrix that connected every Necron across the galaxy, of the sheer scale of their harvesting operations. Thousands of worlds, billions of specimens. Genetic diversity from 100 species preserved in perfect stasis, catalogued and stored and maintained against futures that might never come or might arrive in timescales that exceeded stellar lifespans. The Necrons were patient. They had already waited 60 million years. They could wait 60 million more, and in all that time their specimens would remain unchanged, would experience nothing, would exist in perfect preservation until the moment, if the moment ever came, when some ancient calculation determined they had utility beyond their value as stored data. I died in the command chair of Station Tertius, 970, 2 years and 47 days after the harvest of Tertium-7. My last thought was of Callus and Prentice and all my men, wondering if they would ever wake, if they would ever know how much time had passed, if they would remain frozen forever in chambers beneath worlds that had forgotten they ever existed. The Necrons collected my body, added it to their samples, one more specimen for the biological archives. My consciousness ended, but my genetic material didn't. It was preserved, catalogued, stored alongside the 300 million souls of Tertium-7, part of humanity's involuntary contribution to archives that would outlast the Imperium itself. And beneath the empty streets of Tertium-7, beneath the cities reclaimed by nature and time, the stasis chambers continued their function. 300 million people frozen in eternal now, experiencing nothing, aging not at all, waiting for purposes that might never arrive. The Necrons returned to their sleep, their harvest complete, their data collected, their patience infinite. Other worlds would follow. Other populations would be collected with the same methodical efficiency. The Imperium would fight, would resist, would throw billions of lives against enemies that simply repaired themselves and resumed collection. And sometimes the Necrons would withdraw, their quotas met, their samples sufficient, their interest elsewhere. And sometimes they would persist, would harvest entire systems, would add billions more to archives that already held numbers beyond human comprehension. The galaxy turned, stars died and were reborn. The Imperium ground forward with its eternal wars and its endless consumption of human life, in service to doctrines and an emperor who had stopped answering prayers 10,000 years ago. And in hidden chambers scattered across 1,000 harvested worlds, the collected specimens waited in perfect stasis. Humanity's involuntary contribution to archives, maintained by things that had forgotten how to die and couldn't remember how to live. Tertium-7 remained empty. No one came to resettle it. The administrator marked it as lost to unknown Xenos activity and redirected resources elsewhere. The manufactorums fell silent. The lights eventually failed. The cities crumbled. Nature reclaimed what humanity had built and forgot that anything had ever lived there. But deep in the earth, the chambers remained. Perfect preservation maintaining 300 million lives in eternal suspension, unchanged and unchanging, waiting for a purpose that might arrive tomorrow, or might arrive in 60 million years when the last stars had burned out and the galaxy itself was dying. They had been harvested, not killed, not destroyed, harvested, stored, preserved against futures unknown. And in a galaxy where death came quickly and violently to most of humanity, where life was measured in servitude and suffering, and the Imperium consumed its citizens as thoroughly as any enemy, perhaps that stasis was mercy. Perhaps frozen unconsciousness was better than the alternatives that awaited those who lived and served and died in the Emperor's name. Or perhaps it was the worst fate imaginable, consciousness preserved but inactive, existence without experience, life without living, trapped forever in the moment of collection, while time flowed on without them. Centuries and millennia passing in darkness and silence and perfect frozen stillness. The Necrons didn't care which interpretation was correct. They had their samples. They had their data. They had fulfilled their harvesting protocols with the same brutal efficiency they applied to everything. Purpose served, calculations complete. They returned to sleep in their tomb complexes to wait for the next awakening, the next collection, the next addition to archives that would outlast empires and species, and perhaps reality itself. Now you know what lies beneath the Imperium's glory, what waits in the depths, what harvests with precision while humanity dies in chaos. If you dare witness more truths about what really threatens the galaxy, subscribe. They told us the Emperor protects, but protection never came. Only collection, only storage, only eternal waiting in chambers beneath worlds that forgot we existed. And somewhere in those chambers, frozen in perfect stasis, 300 million souls from Tertium-7 continue their wait. Callus, Prentice, General Hatek. The naval crews who came to rescue them. Every civilian who walked with synchronized precision into pyramids that have long since phased back into the earth. All of them preserved, unchanging, experiencing nothing, forever. Or until the Necrons decide their samples have utility, whichever comes first.